Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to AEI and this evening's event, Old Whigs and Prudence Today, a book talk and discussion with Greg Weiner. And welcome to all those watching this event online. I'm Gary Schmidt. I'm a resident scholar in the Strategic Studies and American Institutions here at AEI. Format today is pretty straightforward. We'll hear from Greg first up, and then we'll turn to some responses and discussion by Professor Diana Schaub and AEI scholar Yuval Levin. I'll then try to moderately moderate a discussion between the four of us, and then we'll close with a question and answer session with our guests here. We'll try to adjourn promptly at 7 o'clock. Before Professor Weiner takes the podium, however, let me do the brief introduction of both him and our panelists. First, Greg is a visiting scholar at AEI. He is currently the provost and vice president for academic affairs at Assumption College in Massachusetts, where he also teaches political science. He also directs the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Center for Scholarship and Statesmanship, and probably mows the campus lawns on weekends after doing all that. Greg worked for a number of years on Capitol Hill, as well as Yuval and I, and he's the author of 4 books, including this recent book, which we're going to talk about, Old Whigs, Burke, Lincoln, and the Politics of Prudence, which is the center of today's discussion, and 3 other fine volumes, one on the question of judicial supremacy, another book on Senator Moynihan, and then finally an extremely fine book on James Madison, not that the other books aren't fine as well. Professor Weiner has a PhD from Georgetown University. Our next speaker will be Diana Schaub, who is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where her work is focused on American political thought and history. Her day job includes teaching political science at Loyola College in Maryland. The author of numerous essays in political theory and literature, Diana is co-editor with Amy and Leon Cass of what so proudly we hail the American soul in story, speech, and song. And she's also the author of Erotic Liberalism, Women and Revolution in Montesquieu's Persian Letters. I might add, in the context of today's discussion, she is also the author of a monograph, quote, or title of which is Emancipating the Mind, Lincoln, the Founders, and Scientific Progress, which was a lecture she gave at the Walter Burns Constitution Day lecture here in 2018. And Diana is also the moderator of AEI's video series on Lincoln and constitutional statesmanship. She has her PhD from the University of Chicago. Yuval Levin is a resident scholar and director of the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies here at AEI and is the founding editor of National Affairs. He has worked in the White House on domestic policy, and he was executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics. He also worked on Capitol Hill, working for member committee and also the leadership. He is the author of several books on political theory and public policy, and most recently the book, The Fractured Republic, Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism. And for today's purposes, I should note he's also the author of The Great Debate, Edmund, Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Right and Left. Yuval has also received his doctorate from the University of Chicago. There's kind of a theme going on here. Now, I'll try to be a moderate moderator, so let me close with just a short remark that it's within my memory that many leading conservatives held up Edmund Burke as the political philosopher par excellence, precisely because of his wariness of abstract political principles, whereas they often described Lincoln as quite the opposite. They saw Lincoln as someone whom they thought had overturned that prudent approach to political life, and in speeches such as the Gettysburg Address, put America on a dangerous crusading march for equality. Greg's book is an important and substantive correction of that division, helping to correct our understanding of both Burke and Lincoln. The question I suspect we'll get into today, however, is whether there isn't some partial truth in that earlier understanding of the two, and then again, how that difference might or might not matter for today's political discourse. Greg, podium is yours.
Thank you, Gary, for that introduction. I want to thank Diana and Yuval for being here. They very generously wrote blurbs for the book. I might add a disposition that I assume will continue unabated this evening. I'm profoundly grateful also to Yuval for the privilege of being associated with this institution, to Jackson, who is over there for his research assistance. And it's also delightful to see a couple of my former students at Assumption here. We live in an age that aches for the virtue of prudence. Colloquially, prudence connotes caution, but one argument the book makes is that prudence is neither inherently cautious, though it does, thanks to Burke, have a cautious dimension, nor intrinsically bold. Rather, prudence is the calibration of statecraft to circumstance. If this definition is compelling, the gateway to prudence is ascertaining the character of one's times and placing it in relief against both the past and the future. I'm going to begin by summarizing the argument of the book, and then I want to float the thesis that we lack prudence today, first and foremost because we have mistaken the character of our times. These are not, despite what polemicists on both sides, dare I say including me, say are the end of days. They are times of challenge, but not catastrophe. Our capacity to assess these questions hinges on how we define prudence. The Oxford English Dictionary calls it, quote, the ability to recognize and follow the most suitable or sensible course of action, good sense in practical or financial affairs, discretion, circumspection, caution. Attention lies at the heart of that definition. The ability to recognize and follow the most suitable or sensible course of action sometimes entails circumspection and caution. I would offer that it does more often than not. But sometimes, and here is where we must grapple with Burke and Lincoln, it entails daring statecraft. That is the great challenge and enduring attraction of these two thinkers and statesmen. They were both theorists of prudence and practitioners of boldness. Aquinas says providence is, quote, the principal part of prudence. He continues, the other two parts of prudence, memory of the past and understanding of the present, are subordinate to it, helping us decide how to provide for the future. Burke expressed much the same sentiment when he said that, quote, a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve taken together would be my standard of a statesman. Burke's unique contribution to our understanding of prudence was to theorize its cautious dimension is rooted in what he called a moral rather than a complexional timidity. That is, a timidity arising from humility in the face of our limited ability to comprehend the infinite complexity of human and particularly of social affairs. But Burke's statesmanship as a member of Parliament was often decidedly untimid. His support of the American colonists while war fever swept Britain is one example. His years-long and doomed impeachment of Warren Hastings supplies another. The clearest example is how Burke stood athwart history and yelled stop when most everyone else was egging the French Revolution on. Burke himself was so wary of the French Revolution's expansion that he asked to be buried in an unmarked grave lest the Jacobins march across England and desecrate his remains. Prudence then implies a capacity to assess circumstances so as to know whether boldness or caution is necessary to achieve virtuous ends. Burke's default position was caution. Please God, he wrote to one meeting of his constituents, I will walk with caution whenever I am not able clearly to see my way before me. In his appeal from the new to the old Whigs, Burke denounced the arrogance of those who felt capable of reconstructing society along metaphysical lines. An ignorant man, he wrote, who is not fool enough to meddle with his clock, is, however, sufficiently confident to think he can safely take to pieces and put together at his pleasure a moral machine of another guy's importance and complexity, composed of far other wheels and springs and balances and counteracting and cooperating powers. We are accustomed to associating caution with cowardice, but Burke called prudence a heroic virtue because it often entailed resisting the power of dominant opinion. One reason for caution was humility. Another was Burke's central teaching that there is no formula into which information can be dumped to generate the right political answer. Burke derided the idea of a formulaic approach to decision-making as arithmetical or geometrical politics. Political choices for him had to be rooted in circumstances and measured by their consequences, rather than being considered in what he called, quote, all the nakedness of metaphysical abstraction. And prudence was necessary to undertake this calibration. So was this. For Burke, politics and perfection did not mix. The attempt to force an imperfect world into a flawless mold produced abuses like what was stunning prescience he foresaw in Jacobin France. That was why Burke called prudence the god of this lower world, with the emphasis on lower. Prudence was the virtue of post-lapsarian man. It was for this reason that politics, as Gary indicated, could not be based on abstract natural rights. Not because natural rights did not exist, but rather because they did exist and were too pristine for the complexities of human experience. Government is not made in virtue of natural rights, he wrote, which may and do exist in total independence of it, and exist in much greater clearness and in a much greater degree of abstract perfection, but their abstract perfection is their practical defect. A politics based on abstraction would tolerate no limits. Limitation was a vital theme of Burkean prudence. In a 1793 parliamentary speech, Burke declared that Jacobin France, quote, was an enemy to limited monarchy as monarchy and to the limitation as limitation. For him, rashness arose from arrogance, as in the reflections which argued for gradual rather than sudden change. Quote, the true lawgiver ought to have a heart full of sensibility. He ought to love and respect his kind and to fear himself. It may be allowed to his temperament to catch his ultimate object with an intuitive glance, but his movements toward it ought to be deliberate. And that, I would argue, could have been a prophecy of the moral and political character of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln provides an illustration of prudence that history will struggle to exceed. Dismissed by radicals as moderate and by conservatives as radical, Lincoln was willing to play a long game on the question of enslavement until immediate action was a military necessity for his paramount object of preserving the Union. He adhered scrupulously to constitutional forms, but occasionally deviated from them to preserve the Constitution itself. If these seem like tensions, they are. Imagine being on the receiving end of Lincoln's January 1863 letter to Joseph Hooker, one of his many commanding generals. And now Lincoln wrote upon his appointment of Hooker, beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance go forward and give us victories. Consider that. Lincoln ordered his general to display energy, but not rashness. He ordered him to go forward, but to be vigilant. What was Hooker supposed to do with that? The answer was prudence. Hooker was supposed to discern what circumstances demanded. To see the fullness of Lincoln's conception of prudence, we need to begin before the crucible of war. The most compelling elaboration of that principle in Lincoln's thought is contained in his 1838 Lyceum address. Speaking at a time of relative peace and prosperity, Lincoln argued that the founding generation's glory could not be rivaled because unique and extraordinary historical circumstances had called forth its greatness. The problem was that the ambition for greatness would persist. Lincoln put it this way, quote, the game is caught, and I believe it is true that with the catching end the pleasures of the chase. This field of glory is harvested, and the crop is already appropriated. But new reapers will arise, and they too will seek a field. These members of what Lincoln called the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle would never be satisfied merely with prudent governance that maintained what others had built. Towering genius, he observed, disdains a beaten path. It thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men. The problem, in other words, was the pursuit of glory in times that did not require it. It was vital to Lincolnian prudence then to understand, as in his communication to General Hooker, when circumstances called for greatness and when they required modesty. When he assumed that bold statecraft would not be necessary again in America, Lincoln failed, of course, to foresee his own greatness. But that was because the circumstances in 1838 and that were foreseeable from that vantage point did not require greatness. We know Lincoln today for his intrepid leadership during the Civil War, which was prudent because national survival was at stake. But contemporaries knew him and often condemned him for his moderate pursuit of ultimate goals, including the end of enslavement. When Lincoln denounced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise in favor of allowing states to choose whether to allow enslavement, his reason was not that individual rights always trumped popular majorities. It was that a national majority had already compromised on the issue, and, quote, who after this, he wondered, will ever trust a national compromise? The spirit of mutual concession, that spirit which first gave us the Constitution and which has thrice saved the Union, we shall have strangled and cast forth from us forever. Lincoln consequently spoke in the argument of putting enslavement, quote, in the course of its ultimate extinction, something his plans for gradual emancipation would not have achieved until as late as 1900. While extensive attention has been given to the unrivaled political reflection of Lincoln's second inaugural, his first, while less poetic, is equally essential for understanding his prudence. He pledged to uphold even those constitutional provisions, such as the Fugitive Slave Clause, that he found odious. But he counseled moderation and prudence to the seceding states as well. Will you hazard so desperate a step, he asked, referring to secession, while there is any possibility that any portion of the ills you fly from have no real existence? Will you, while the certain ills you fly to are greater than all the real ones you fly from? Will you risk the commission of so fearful a mistake? This warning against risk was the cautious dimension of prudence, the one we have encountered in Burke. Lincoln's moderation, bemoaned by so many of his contemporaries, served ultimate goals like preserving the Union and ending enslavement. When Lincoln did act boldly, and the Emancipation Proclamation was certainly bold, it was because the circumstances demanded or permitted it. In comparing Burke with Lincoln, I do not mean to render them identical. Far from it. Burke was suspicious of natural rights, as Gary mentioned. Lincoln often sounded Thomist in rendering natural law and the rights emanating from it universal. Burke emphasized the cautious dimension of prudence. Lincoln was cautious until caution was imprudent. I do mean to suggest that these two men, both of whom described themselves at various times as old Whigs, explained and exemplified prudence in ways that can guide us today, a topic to which I shall now turn. For several reasons, I would submit that these are times of singular imprudence, and that for several reasons. The first is our failure to grasp the character of our times, which is to say our insistence on inflating their importance. We are all Cassandras now. We have gone from one side storming the cockpit in 2016 to the other being certain the plane will go down if they do not win in 2020. Every election is the most important of our lifetimes. In his enthusiasm, one scholar, apparently looking 1864, 1912, 1932, 1980, among others, actually called 2016 the most important election year since 1860. There are, I suspect, three interlocking reasons for this conceit that our times are always the most important times. One is that crisis concentrates power. Crisis is the natural habitat of the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle. The second is that few people and even fewer statesmen want to live in ordinary times. There are, to be sure, those of us who wouldn't mind at least an interval of normality. But as Lincoln taught in the Lyceum Address, normality does not conduce to greatness. And if Lincoln's premise is correct, one conclusion that might follow is that our politics will become more intense as the stakes of our politics shrink. The third is the erosion of constitutional mechanisms that register and reward prudence. In this vein, I would particularly note the decline of Congress's constitutional primacy. Congress's purpose, Madison said in Federalist 10, was to refine and enlarge the public views. These mechanisms, especially the Senate, rely on a Republican patience to which today's speed of light, invent your own reality media environment is inhospitable. If only for the sake of provocation, I would suggest that these are not world historical times, in that they justify neither the wrecking ball that has been taken to Republican mores, which are said to require evasion or destruction because of a constitutional crisis that makes winning more important than what Attorney General Barr recently dismissed as punctilio, nor the hysteria we have witnessed in response. Of course, I may be wrong about the gravity of our times. If so, call me imprudent. The line between Cassandras and Pollyannas is, as Burke described the line between obedience and revolution, faint, obscure, and not easily definable. In either case, I would argue that the unrelenting rhetoric of catastrophe is a bipartisan and troubling phenomenon. In my view, the likeliest scenario for President Trump's reelection, for example, is not satisfaction with his performance, but rather that his Democratic opponents will self-destruct in a frenzied search for crises to solve. None of them will get nominated by calling for a return to normal. The ideology of progress requires a relentless pursuit of sunlit uplands, which in turn demands a constantly gathering storm. Progress requires us constantly to go home in search of monsters to destroy. 92% of Americans are insured. The response is Medicare for all. This no enemies to the left mentality recalls Burke's warning about French legislators becoming, quote, bidders at an auction of popularity, except that this auction is open only to the most partisan primary voters. Burke grasped the dynamic that I think we now witness. Quote, if any of them should happen to propose a scheme of liberty soberly limited and defined with proper qualifications, he will be immediately outbid by his competitors who will produce something more splendidly popular. Suspicions will be raised of his fidelity to his cause. Moderation will be stigmatized as the virtue of cowards, compromise as the prudence of traitors. I do not mean to say that these are thoroughly ordinary times. We are witnessing a process of presidential impeachment, after all. But as Keith Whittington reminds us, it is not a constitutional crisis when the constitutional regime functions as intended. There is a lesson, too, for both sides in the danger of cataclysmic rhetoric, and it is this: if you employ it, you had better produce a cataclysm, which means that we are always in the market for one. The problem is that cataclysms are rarely susceptible of sober solutions, and the more hyperbolic are the terms in which problems are described, the less achievable those solutions will seem. On the conservative side, I would join my fellow originalists in an abiding concern, for example, about the erosion of constitutional forms, even if I cannot endorse a sort of medieval constitutional medicine according to which they must be wounded further in order to save them. I, too, am worried about the decay of civil society and the rise in what Senator Josh Hawley has just called deaths of despair. On the other side, I will hazard telling this audience that I believe climate change is a serious and documented problem. But describing any of these situations, crises if you prefer, in apocalyptic terms, simply discourages the belief that they can be solved. It elevates our exigencies over our assets. If everything is a cataclysm, nothing is. If every social or political problem is a meteor hurtling toward the earth to kill us all, voters can be forgiven for throwing up their hands rather than rolling up their sleeves. Instead, prudence counsels sobriety in both our description of problems and our approach to them. And we do have problems, serious ones at that. The capacity of our institutions of government and civil society to address them is eroding. I would not object to calling the situation critical. But by way of closing, I do, on prudential grounds, oppose the rhetoric of calamity. Perhaps, in addition to the wisdom of Burke and Lincoln, we could profit from the prudence of the circa 1980s David Mamet character who asked if he had noticed Western civilization was collapsing, replied, I live in a pretty good neighborhood. Thank you.
We are here both to discuss Greg's wonderful book and to think about the sorry fate of political prudence today. As Greg notes in his introductory chapter, it's very difficult to resuscitate a languishing virtue when its very definition has been so restricted and misconstrued. Instead of being understood as comprehensive political wisdom, practical wisdom, the term prudence now connotes caution to the point of timidity or cowardice even. It occurred to me that evidence of this regime, of this virtue's transformation and then disappearance can be found in an unusual place: baby names. It used to be fairly common for parents to bestow virtue names on children. In 1880, Prudence was the 400th most popular girl's name. Since 1948, however, it hasn't appeared among the top 1,000 names. By contrast, the Christian virtues, faith, hope, charity, still make the list, as does, amazingly enough, temperance. It was listed at 854th most popular in 2014. Perhaps the decline of political prudence was already foreshadowed when the Puritans appropriated it as a woman's name. Reduced to feminine carefulness in matters of the household, it lost its ancient status as the intellectual virtue specific to rulers. Once prudence was redefined as caution, it was only a matter of time before it lost favor even as a woman's virtue, particularly in a feminist age where women too must be bold and assertive. To the extent that it was Burke, as Greg claims, who first fully theorized prudence as essentially involving caution as a sort of default position rooted in the moral virtue of humility, Burke perhaps bears some responsibility for our current dilemma, where prudence seems unattractively tame, not like Aristotle's ruling intellectual virtue at all. I must admit that my own first reaction to Burke's endorsement of moral timidity was deep dismay. Certainly moral courage is better than moral timidity. Greg, however, marvelously draws out and vindicates Burke's meaning, explaining his profound insight into the limits of human reason and the grounding of political judgment in existential modesty. Since I wrote a highly complimentary blurb for Greg's book, I may not be the best person to now offer critical commentary. But since I've learned from Greg about how prudence can balance opposites, I assume it would not be imprudent to now mix my praise with some blame, or if that's too strong, at least to dissent a bit from his presentation of Lincoln. Greg begins by dividing Lincoln's speeches and actions into two camps: those illustrative of the decisive importance of caution in Lincoln's prudence, and another set that he places under the rubric of boldness as prudence. Although I am going to quarrel with Greg's categorization of specific examples, I want to stress that my larger point is actually to call these very categories, caution and boldness, into question. In its deliberative quest for the wisest course of action, prudence is all of a piece. It may be part of our lingering Machiavellian hangover to think in terms of these antipodal temperamental modes. Let me start with a couple of examples that appear in the boldness as prudence section. Greg describes as bold Lincoln's resistance to compromise during the 4-month interval between his election and his inauguration. Lincoln did indeed show inflexible resolve against congressional schemes to placate the secessionists. But it seems to me he did so not because, as Greg says, the issue of slavery most called forth his assertive spirit, but rather because, as Lincoln explained, the very meaning of free elections was at stake. Actions that might look bold, when judged from the outside, so to speak, were usually for Lincoln actions he felt constrained to, actions mandated by his understanding of duty, and most especially actions required by his oath of office. In another instance, Greg calls Lincoln's insistence on proceeding with the 1864 election which is to say Lincoln's refusal to consider canceling the election on the pretext of civil war, perhaps Lincoln's boldest move. Now, of course, Lincoln might well have lost that election. For a long time, he believed he was going to lose that election. And in that sense, it was risky to both him and the nation. But Lincoln did not view going forward with the 1864 election as bold. The language he used focused on the principle at stake and the requirements of the Constitution. Once again, from Lincoln's perspective, it was all duty, all necessity. Finally, and maybe most consequentially, Greg argues that Lincoln was bold in his employment of war measures. He suggests that Lincoln acted temporarily outside the channels of normal law. Greg relates this to preserving the anti-Machiavellian distinction between the ordinary case and the extreme case. As Greg puts it, necessity does not make constitutionality. If I read him right, Greg allows for extraordinary measures on grounds of necessity, but resists constitutionalizing those acts. Thus, Lincoln behaved briefly as a benevolent dictator. This does not seem to me to be Lincoln's understanding of the issue. As he says in the famous letter to Albert Hodges, "Nor was it my view that I might take an oath to get power and break the oath in using the power." Throughout the war, Lincoln defends the full constitutionality of his actions, citing explicit provisions of the Constitution, such as that allowing for the suspension of habeas corpus, citing as well the take care clause of Article 2, and finally, most often, citing the presidential oath. Essentially, Lincoln's understanding is that the Constitution itself is roomy enough to meet extreme cases, by the way that the founders prudently constitutionalized executive discretion and prerogative without collapsing the distinction between the ordinary and the extreme cases. Lincoln is quite frank about his interpretation. "I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation." As he had explained in a public letter in 1863, the Constitution is not, in its application in all respects, the same in cases of rebellion or invasion involving the public safety as it is in time of profound peace and public security. The Constitution itself makes the distinction. In justifying each of these actions, Lincoln refers to indispensable necessity. I wonder, Greg, what you make of this language. Is it a kind of Machiavellianism, where the strong man tries to disguise his bold choice as no choice at all? Is Lincoln's talk of necessity just rhetorical pretext, the means by which he makes his ruling prudence compatible with democratic proprieties? Or was Lincoln sincere in saying that he had not controlled events, but rather they had controlled him? If that is true, then we might be looking for his prudence in the wrong places. Resisting compromise with the secessionists, summoning the war power of the government, freeing the slaves, going forward with the second election, were all determined by Lincoln's rigorous thought about the nature and scope of his duty. His self-presentation certainly presses out of view the judicious choosing among options that seems to be so much a part of prudence. My hunch is that Lincoln's prudence is found not so much in his major wartime actions as in his words, which is to say, in his judicious management of public opinion, his skill as a party organizer, his handling of the men about him, from his cabinet to his generals. It was in those realms that the means to given ends were a matter requiring judgment. To illustrate, let me respond to one more of Greg's examples. In September 1862, a delegation representing a large group of Chicago churches visited the White House to press for the emancipation of the slaves. Greg calls Lincoln's words on this occasion perhaps his most powerful statement of prudent accommodation to circumstance, since Lincoln runs through a variety of reasons why emancipation would be impracticable or ineffective. So Greg sees this instance as the cautious side of prudence at work. I agree that Lincoln delayed issuing the proclamation for a variety of reasons, involving considerations of both principle and expedience. Nonetheless, I want to suggest that Lincoln's display of hesitancy here is eminently rhetorical in the best sense. His prudence is to be found less in the actual statements that he makes and more in the statements that he adroitly elicits from his visitors. I'm going to explain that as soon as I have. So the delegation of Chicago clergymen who were pressing for emancipation arrived just 10 days before Lincoln made the big announcement. At the time of their visit, the proclamation had already been drafted and presented to the cabinet. Lincoln was simply awaiting the full ripening of the moment. With prudence, ripeness is all. The arrival of the preachers provided him a unique opportunity to prepare the wider public for his announcement. His discussion with them is a remarkably Socratic encounter. I don't think there's anything remotely similar to it in the annals of presidential rhetoric. His meeting with the delegation takes the form of a dialogue. Lincoln makes all the anti-emancipation arguments, prompting his visitors to formulate all the pro-emancipation arguments, and to do so through reasoned assessments of the current situation. Occasionally, Lincoln grants the weight of his interlocutor's points, thereby giving the distinct impression that he is being forced into glory, pulled along toward emancipation by military necessity, the demands of public opinion, and for good measure, the will of God, too. The write-up of the exchange was not published by Lincoln, but rather was immediately sent to the newspapers by the delegation. I read the whole thing as a masterful abnegation on Lincoln's part. Real agency is portrayed as residing elsewhere, as Lincoln himself may have sincerely believed. Yet Lincoln is the one actively shaping this public perception. It's almost an exercise in ventriloquism. As the delegation gives voice to the prudential pro-emancipation arguments that Lincoln very much wants to put into circulation, the clergyman's high-minded moral influence shapes the public tone. And in fact, in his reminiscence decades later, the chairman of the delegation showed his awareness that something like this was being played out. Here's what he said. The seemingly strong objections which he urged to our request struck us as in a measure old and outworn, as if they'd lost to his mind most of the force which they might once have had. We thought it probable that if the approaching battle at Antietam should prove favorable to the Union cause, it would be followed by a proclamation of emancipation. And indeed, within 2 weeks, that is what happened, with the publication of the reported conversation paving the way. Thus, Lincoln was not only himself superlatively prudent, he was concerned to educate the public in the art of political reasoning. During his presidency, he composed a series of extremely influential public letters. They were his version of tweets, by which he forwarded this project of citizen education. We certainly have no such preceptors around today, but as Greg's book demonstrates, it's possible to take great statesmen of the past as models for study and emulation. It's hard to do much better than Edmund Burke and Abraham Lincoln, especially with Greg as our guide. Thanks.
Well, following Greg and Diana is a fool's errand, and I am your designated fool. I do want to start by just noting with pleasure that all of us on this stage are now AI scholars in one form or another, and just to say how great it is to be part of an institution that makes itself a home to this kind of conversation and to the people who compose it. Not only Greg and Diana, but Gary too, each in their own way, offer us a model of what a serious scholar of American public life ought to be, and it's really an honor to call them all colleagues. This great book is an example of Greg's way of showing us what scholarship can offer our public life. It's a brilliant concept, and it's just fantastically well executed. By comparing Burke and Lincoln, the book brings out angles and elements of the idea of prudence that I think would be very difficult to see otherwise. And I want to focus on a few of these in ways that maybe not quite exactly what Greg intends to bring out, but maybe they are, and we can see. Certainly the striking similarities between Burke and Lincoln tell us a lot, particularly around the idea which Greg brought out in his remarks, that prudence is maybe above all the ability to tell the difference between times of crisis and times of normal politics, a subject that turns out to be enormously relevant to our contemporary situation in America, as I'll get to also. But the striking differences also tell us at least as much. And they're differences about the nature of judgment, maybe the nature of reason. There's a distinction between them that I couldn't help but see as, at some level, a distinction between two notions of the relation of reason to politics, a more Platonic notion in Lincoln's case and a more Aristotelian notion in Burke's, that Greg brings out with just exquisite skill. I learned a huge amount from the contrast, though I wonder if Greg would put it in those terms. But as I'm here, I think, to talk about Burke in particular, let me say a few words about prudence in Burke and about Greg's treatment of that subject in this book. The first point I'd raise, which Greg brings out very nicely, is that one thing that really stands out about Burke on the question of prudence is his desire to distinguish prudence as a mode of judgment from moderation as a personal and political temperament. The confusion of those two, I think, leads to a common confusion about Burke himself. Among people who know of Edmund Burke but haven't really read him much, I think he's perceived as a kind of calm, soft incrementalist. Barack Obama a few times called himself a Burkean because he wanted to be perceived as a calm, soft incrementalist. And it's true that Burke wanted to change things gradually, but calm and soft he was not. Burke's political writings were almost all motivated by alarm and outrage. All are written in the tone of a man who is just seconds away from completely losing his temper. This is often the most surprising thing about Burke to students who think they know what to expect of him. And there's an intensity there that we might not expect if we identify prudence with temperamental moderation. We also might know in general that Burke is known for wanting to avoid abstract philosophizing in politics, and that's true. But it might lead us to think of his prudentialism as an alternative to a politics of strict principle. You might think this in particular if you've internalized the Straussian slur that Burke is a kind of utilitarian or relativist, a proto-Hegelian or some other sort of monster. But this doesn't really hold up well against any reading of Burke, I think. In fact, if you think about it, Burke is best known to us for some of the instances when he does insist on a politics of principle of a sort against what might be a much easier path of accommodating an injustice for the sake of peace and quiet. In his writing on France, most notably, but also on India and on Ireland, Burke calls on his countrymen to stand up for principle in the face of expediency. Even in calling for reconciliation with the Americans, and ultimately, at least implicitly, backing independence for the Americans, Burke does not suggest that abstract principle is on the other side of the issue exactly. He chastises the government for a mistaken idea of what principle is at stake in the debate. It's worth noticing that one thing that holds these famous instances of Burkean obstinacy together is that they involve questions outside the usual frame of domestic British political affairs. They aren't the kinds of things that the British Constitution, as he understands it, exists to contend with on a regular basis. They posed a crisis. And this really gets to an essential point for Burke, and a point essential to understanding the relationship that he perceived, I think, between prudence and principle in politics. Burke suggests that most of the time, Politics is a matter of judgments among options that are equally legitimate but not equally wise. Most of the time. This is what I think he means by the extraordinary comment that he makes in a letter to the Duke of Richmond, a famous letter from 1773, that, quote, "nearly every political question I have ever known has had so much of the pro and con in it that nothing but the success could decide which proposition ought to have been adopted." In other words, you can only know what was right and wrong in retrospect. But there are some times, and these are the most consequential times in politics, when the issue at stake is not just the choice among equally legitimate alternatives, but implicates some fundamental character or principle of the regime. And it's absolutely essential that one choice and not another is made in those times. In those moments, a statesman has to be willing to put everything on the line. Prudence is important for helping us navigate the first and more normal kind of politics, for helping us make choices that could go either way, telling us which would be the wiser course. But prudence is all the more important, absolutely essential, for helping us navigate the second kind of politics, both for telling the difference between normal times and times of crisis, and for helping us keep our head in those times of crisis. So how does it do that? Here I think there's something that could be brought out of Burke a little more explicitly than Greg brings out, it seems to me. In both kinds of instances, the normal and the crisis, prudence works by providing us with certain kinds of patterns drawn from historical experience. Wise judgments are not just applications of pure principle. And the reason for that, as Burke sees it, as Greg suggests, is not that politics shouldn't aim to be principled, but that we cannot know the nature of justice in clear, scientific sorts of ways. The experience of politics, the history of our society, is how we can come to know it. This points to a connection between Burke's understanding of how political change should happen and his understanding of prudence. I want to lay it out just briefly. Burke argues that there is a human nature, and there are natural principles of justice too, but that our capacity to know them directly is very limited. We rarely really know them as principles in the abstract. Instead, we know them through the lens of our society's experience. The historical experience of social and political life consists in essence of a kind of rubbing up against these principles or a banging into them. The institutions and practices that survive that experience come to take on something of the shape of those principles. So over time, provided that they develop gradually and incrementally, societies come to express in their institutions, in their charters, their traditions, their habits, a kind of model, a sort of simulacrum of the standard of justice, so that over a long time, society as it exists comes to offer a kind of approximation of society as it should exist, and so a model for judgment about political change. Social and political change can help to bring a society slowly closer to the standard, if only by degrees, but that's only likely to happen if that change is in keeping with the spirit of that society's pre-existing forms and orders, if it's incremental and evolutionary. This is Burke's case for gradual change. It's a case rooted in humility about human knowledge, and it's therefore also Burke's case for prudence, which, as Greg's book so powerfully brings out, is also rooted in an underlying humility. Prudence draws from the history of our society a kind of political wisdom, an idea of what course to take now, of how to handle the present. And it draws out of the history of our society also a sense of how to tell the difference between normal political choices and moments of absolute existential danger that have to be treated very differently. And again, a sense of how to handle those kinds of times of crisis. Without a deep and subtle knowledge of your own society's history, then, it's practically impossible to be a prudent statesman. And maybe it's also impossible to be a prudent citizen. This gets to the final point that I'd want to make about some of the implications of Greg's case for our contemporary circumstances. We're living in a moment that presents us with constant failures of prudence, but that's defined above all by a particular kind of very widespread failure of prudence, a failure, as Greg says, to tell the difference between normal political judgments and existential decisions. In our politics now, both parties make their cases to their voters by demanding that we treat every election, every controversy, every day, every tweet as deciding the fate of our society. Our political rhetoric is relentlessly catastrophist, relentlessly apocalyptic, and that makes prudence practically impossible. It would treat every political choice as existing outside the framework of normal politics, the framework of legitimate options that should be judged by their likely consequences. Instead, it wants us to see every political choice as about the very deepest questions, and so as pitting good and evil, legitimacy and illegitimacy, against each other. It tends to treat politics as an arena where one side breaks rules and the other side enforces rules, rather than as an arena for bargaining and compromise and deliberation. Our leaders certainly lack prudence, and this certainly has to do with a shortage of historical knowledge and a deep sense of our society. A lot of what our president does strikes some of us as bizarre and inappropriate because it indicates a total lack of awareness of American history and context. Awareness that terms like America First have a particular past in our particular society, or that some ways of talking about race or about nationalism or about corruption or presidential power are linked to historical memories that run deep for Americans. The president doesn't seem to have those memories, and the same is true to a lesser degree of other political leaders too. But I think it's also the case now that our electorate, the broader public, suffers from this kind of lack of prudence in a way that might require some new thinking about this subject. The tendency to see every moment as the edge of an abyss is not just a function of an overly ambitious or a corrupt elite. It defines our political culture, and it raises the question of what a shortage of prudence among a democratic public might entail, and how that kind of imprudence could be addressed. And I wonder what Greg would think of that challenge, because his framing of prudence is the more classical Aristotelian framing that treats prudence as much more necessary in leaders than in a community. But we're seeing now what its absence looks like on a broader scale, and Greg's book should cause us to take up that unfamiliar question a little bit more directly. So these are just a few loose reflections, but they suggest that this is a particularly important time to be thinking about the question of prudence, and this is certainly a particularly valuable book for helping us to do that.
Well, Greg, any responses? I'm glad I'm not sitting in your chair.
Sure. I agree with everything nice that was said. And, no, I'm honored by the responses, and particularly by the critiques. I was taken by one phrase of Diana's, which was that Lincoln's most important actions were determined by his process or constrained, I think was the way that you put it, by his process of reasoning. That strikes me as right, although it seems to me there's still an intervening prudence between the thought and the logical conclusions, the rigor of the logic, and the action, the pace of the action in particular. There's always a temptation when reading anyone to read into them what you want them to be, and I may be guilty of that in overstating. I'm not sure it's overstating Lincoln's prudence, but in understating the sort of axiomatic nature of his thinking. Let me just say one thing in response to Yuval's last point, which I think is very important about the importance of a prudent citizenry. And I think that's true. I mean, we're all swept up in this constant cycle of one cataclysm after another, and it wouldn't do leaders much good if the people weren't playing along. When I was in graduate school, my mentor, George Carey, asked me once, I can't remember what we were discussing, but how do you teach prudence? And I don't know. I think, but I think there is a danger if we render it into the sort of mystical quality of judgment that some people have and some people don't. I mean, I think one can be formed for prudence in the sense, particularly in the sense of that moral timidity, the humility in the face of social complexity, and so on and so forth. I think renewing the actual, not the ideological, but the actual teaching of history would help with that. But there is a dispositional element to prudence. And there's certainly some people who naturally have more of it than others do. But I think the basics are accessible if we can accept a few premises about human nature and about the complexity of society. So that's a brief answer to the 2 points that struck me as particularly salient, but I would love to get into others as well.
One of the questions I had was this came up as Yuval was talking and it reminded me. So Burke's understanding of how you, as you said, bump into principle, you wonder how relevant that can be when it comes to the American regime. So, I mean, he's dealing with a different kind of, era, a different kind of regime. And I wonder if Lincoln's method, moving from, as Yuval was talking about, almost a Platonic kind of, here's the principle, and I'm going to sort of figure out the best way to get to it, and whether that's just the way the American leadership has to be. I mean, when we think about American history, we don't think about the prudent events. We think about the Revolution. We think about Civil War. We think about, sort of defeating fascism, the Civil Rights Act, and the like. So I wonder how relevant the Burkean model can be for American regime, let alone a modern American regime.
It's a very good question. I think there are two dimensions of it. One is, can it be relevant for a regime of natural rights, which I think is overstated in the American experience. If we have a sort of immaculate conception in 1776 and ignore the sort of gradual evolution of ideas before then. In terms of, you're quite correct to note that we remember the Revolution, we remember the Civil War, the defeat of fascism, and so forth. But if we elevate those, and here I'm going to play off of Yuval a bit, if we elevate those to the only politics that matter, then we lose the opportunity for either, not just for exercising prudence in normal politics, but for recognizing normal politics. In fact, I would argue we have a disincentive for normal politics. So one of my former students who are here will know, one of my pet peeves is rankings of presidential greatness. Because rankings of presidential greatness, I've formulated this as success equals change divided by time. Right? The more you change in the shorter period, the more successful a president you are. So if you ask students who are the great presidents, you get who you would expect: Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt. Some will say Reagan, some will say Kennedy, or pick your poison. But they're all the crisis presidents, right? I haven't heard Calvin Coolidge yet. I'm holding out for that. I haven't heard George H.W. Bush yet. And you can pick your who you believe is prudent on either side for that exercise, but they don't even get the dignity of being remembered as the worst presidents, right? They just sort of consign to this oblivion of the middle of these rankings. And I think what that does, and here I would go back to the Lyceum Address, is it provides a constant, unrelenting search for, as I playfully said with John Quincy Adams, for a constant search for monsters to destroy. When in fact, typically, to be redundant, politics is more normal than that.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I'm going to speak up for studying the Declaration and the Civil War above all. Since Lincoln says he never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence, I take it is possible to put together the grounding in natural right with prudence. And in fact, the words of the Declaration themselves are not a bad place to begin, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. You get the listing of principles, but the very next word is prudence. Prudence indeed will dictate that, government's long established, so on and so forth. So it seems to me that the revolutionary moment is a pretty good way to get access to the compatibility of principle and prudence.
Of course, nobody actually gets beyond the inalienable rights part of it.
Well, okay, teaching the tradition in its fullness. I guess I want to push back a little bit on the characterization of the Lyceum Address, and this goes to the point that you're making about difference between normal times and extreme times. I mean, maybe you could say that what's happening now is an indication that people really are political beings. And if we really are political beings, then we are not content to live as epigones and to say that, our times don't matter. And it seems to me that Lincoln is facing that question in the Lyceum Address. But the Lyceum Address is not just a pitch for caution and deference, because that speech ends with a call for new pillars to maintain the edifice of liberty. And the reason, and the fact that Lincoln calls for new pillars is an indication that the old pillars are insufficient. And that involves a kind of critique of the founding generation and the way in which the founding depended on the evocation of certain passions. So Lincoln says if we really want to show that self-government is possible, we're going to have to put self-government on a new foundation, on the foundation of reason. Only when human beings are themselves self-governed individually in their own souls will self-government in the large be possible. So it seems to me, actually, that in the Lyceum Address, Lincoln gives us a pretty high standard and a kind of new task. In other words, it seems to me he believes each and every generation has a high task to meet. So now, it doesn't mean that we need exactly the language of crisis, but it does seem to me that we need to become more aware. And so I actually think Lincoln is an Aristotelian, and he understands us as political beings, and therefore there has to be a substantial political project for each and every generation.
And Diana will be able to correct the quote I'm about to botch, but it's new pillars hewn from the solid quarry of sober reason.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Sober, but
yes.
reason.
Oh, yeah.
Sober, but reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's that dimension of Lincoln that is undeniable, but I don't think that is incompatible with his warning that the appetite for greatness can induce abuse. Right?
Sure. In other words, the problem is going to be you've got the people engaged in kind of mob rule, and then you've got these aspiring demagogues and dictators who come along who can capitalize on that and in some fundamental way transform the regime. So he's encouraging a kind of channeling of the ambition of this next generation into the maintenance and preservation of our form of government. But that itself is a high and demanding task.
That's definitely a high and demanding task, and it's a constant task. So that I wouldn't disagree with, but it does seem to me there's a warning against crisis mongering that goes along with that. That's part of self-government, is the prudence to recognize the character of one's times.
But isn't Lincoln saying there is a kind of crisis? I mean, he gives the spread of mob rule, that's the crisis of the moment, and then he foresees a more dangerous looming crisis, namely these lurking folks of overweening ambition, the Napoleons and Caesars.
Well, but that's fair. The mob rule is certainly a kind of crisis, and I think one problem when we teach the Lyceum Address is we tend to treat it like two speeches, rather than putting them together. The warning against mob rule and
they are connected.
They are connected, yeah. But it does. I'm not sure we're saying anything incompatible here. It does seem to me that there is a clear warning, a clear statement that not all times are going to be extraordinary, right? So even if the maintenance of self-government is a heroic effort, if it's going on generation to generation, there is something, I don't want to quite say ordinary about it, but I'm going to say ordinary just to provoke conversation. I mean, if every moment is existential, then it seems both ripe for abuse and ripe for devaluing the currency of crisis when it actually occurs.
You all.
Well, so a number of things to respond to, but I would say one way to bridge the distance between prudence as a character of the statesman and prudence as a challenge of public education for Burke certainly is found in the concept of national character, which is a very important idea for Burke. I think it's the core idea of the Reflections on the French Revolution that describe over and over this British public that brings to bear a kind of character to political crisis that is above all prudential and cautious, but willing to act in defense of its inheritance in bold ways. And there's a lot of exaggeration in that. One of the first readers of the Reflections was Burke's friend John O'Hara, who read everything for him. And he said, who are these people? Who is this British public? I would love to meet these people. I don't recognize them at all. And Burke responds saying that he's basically intentionally providing a description of the British people that they should wish were true. And it's a description that has a prudent national character at its center. And Burke thought the Americans had a national character before their independence. His argument to Parliament about why it was a foolish thing to force them into this fight about taxes is an argument about the American national character. The speech on conciliation I take to be a speech about the American national character that is admirable in many ways, though it madly overvalues personal liberty and identifies it with low taxes. First of all, that's kind of a recognizable picture of American national character. But I think it also takes seriously this question of how you can educate for prudence. And it takes national character to be a characteristic of educated citizens that needs to be tended but can be sustained. And that I think does offer a kind of bridge to a prudence that's not purely a virtue of the leader alone in a democratic society. I would also say to this question between the two of you that it seems to me that there is a tension on this question within the Lyceum Address that might help us too. The Lyceum Address, Lincoln starts saying that his subject is the perpetuation of our political institutions, which I think he could have started most of his speeches that way. Certainly the Gettysburg Address is about that very subject. It was an obsession for him, that subject. And perpetuation is a strange sort of thing. It is a response to challenge, and so in some ways it is a response to crisis, but it also is a permanent necessity in politics. And I take Lincoln to be describing in the Lyceum Address a permanent problem that is a crisis, and that requires a certain kind of extraordinary response, but on a more or less permanent basis. And the response is not just the kind of civic religion argument, but it's a recognition of the tension between the rule of the people and the rule of law, which I think is what that speech is about in many ways. It's very relevant to us. It's almost exactly about populism. And it suggests that this tension between the rule of the public and the rule of law is a constant problem for a democratic society that has to be tended to by a certain kind of public education.
So, can I jump in?
Yeah, you bet.
Let me see if I can, I'm going to see if I can provoke Diana here.
It's not hard.
The Lyceum Address, it seems to me in some ways makes Burke's argument about the dangers of abstract politics, right? Because he concludes that first part of the speech with let every American, every lover of liberty swear on the blood of his fathers, right? That's an interesting formulation because it suggests some reverence for one's fathers. Never to violate the law in the least particular, right? This seems to me to be reason gone. I was trying to get to the airport in Boston this morning, and for those of you who have ever done that, you know that you occasionally have to drive 66 rather than 65, and so on and so forth. So that seems to me to be an unattainable standard, and I'm not sure it's even.
There weren't as many laws around when Lincoln.
No, fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. But it doesn't seem to me to be either an attainable standard or even a desirable one.
It would certainly have ruled out the American Revolution, wouldn't it?
No, I don't think so, because Lincoln is talking about when you are in a democratic system living under laws that you've had a say in. So he certainly makes clear that the right of revolution is permissible.
In that speech? I mean, there's an amazing line in that speech where he says that there's never any acceptable reason for violating even an unjust law.
But that's because there are democratic avenues to correcting the law and repealing the law, fixing the law. So, and until that can take place, you must obey, religiously obey. So I think it's the same, in a way, it's the same argument that Washington makes in his speech about the Whiskey Rebellion, where Washington says, yeah, sure, we started we had a revolution, but now we live under laws of our own making, and Washington's trying to get people to understand what democratic theory is. Everybody has agreed to be bound by the determinations of the majority.
Which I think amplifies the I don't want to call, Lincoln is certainly not a simple majoritarianism, but he certainly is a small r Republican.
Yeah, a constitutional majority is how he describes it. Constitutional majority.
See if I can pick at another fight. So one of the things that is noticeable when you're talking about Lincoln's actions and speeches, arguably the most notable speech Lincoln makes is the Gettysburg Address, but it's really very lightly touched upon in the book. And I wonder if that's because it's the one speech that really is the most abstract and the most demanding about moving forward with this idea. And there's no sense of like there's a limit. There's a sense of this is something that the world needs. This is something, there's not even a mention in the United States. It's obviously referred to, but it's not a very Burkean style speech.
That's absolutely fair, and he also has this correspondence with the working men of is it Manchester and somewhere else about the universal nature of the ideal. So I would not equate them, certainly not with respect to natural rights, and even with respect to the sort of axiomatic nature of Lincoln's thinking. I don't think Lincoln is a Platonist and Burke is an Aristotelian. I'm bristling a little bit at it, but
that's why I said it.
Yeah. And I tend to agree with Diana just said Lincoln's an Aristotelian. I tend to agree with that. It's possible that Gettysburg deserved more attention. I do not buy to sort of simplify it to oversimplify it unfairly. The theory that America had this sort of, again, as I say, immaculate conception in 1776, and then we departed from it, and then Lincoln restored it at Gettysburg. I think that's too simple of an account. I think, and I'm veering from your question a bit here, that the second inaugural is also there's more of a, I suppose there's a heaviness to all of Lincoln's presidential speeches, but there are abstractions in there as well, particularly those of a religious character. So I take your point. It probably deserves I was focused more on likenesses, but there are certainly clear distinctions that can't be.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to get at is that the Gettysburg Address is something that people would memorize. Second inaugural, nobody's going to memorize that. I mean, kudos to them if they do.
No, don't quiz me. But
when I was in sixth grade, thank God the teacher only said you had to memorize the Gettysburg Address, and I think Lincoln actually intended it to be memorized. So your book points out, he has good reasons why the inaugural address is written the way it is. But can I just jump? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wonder if we could do a little bit more on the topic of citizen prudence and how it might be encouraged. I do agree that our age and young people are very abstract. They have very limited experience of the world and very limited experience with the variety of human character. So it seems to me that anything that builds a familiarity with particulars and complexity is welcome. So the study of history, reading of biography, but maybe especially novel reading. The reading of novels, and students just don't read much of anything any longer. But, think of what that does, introducing you to a whole world of characters, a range of virtues and vices, the sort of moral complexity of human relations. So, I just want to suggest that everybody read the novels of Anthony Trollope, Palliser series and the Barsetshire series, and George Eliot would be my other one, Middlemarch. So, more of a push for novel reading. I really do think it would contribute to.
I agree, because it introduces inevitably in the interplay between characters and situations, a sense of nuance that you can't capture in, I was going to say 180 characters. Is it 280 now?
I'm going to make a real jump, and I hope this works. But you mentioned sort of the decline of Congress acting as a refining body. You mentioned sort of the rhetoric of war all the time, or national emergencies, which is really connected to presidential politics and presidential rhetoric most of the time. But you've written a book about the court, right? And isn't there also something to be said about sort of the way a lot of the key issues in the country are decided by a court, and it's not, there's no nuance. It's you're right, you're wrong, and you got to move forward. So in some respects, all the institutions perhaps are problematic when it comes to this issue of prudence.
What you just described as an abrogation of politics, right? Classically understood. It's politics of, you've all mentioned rules and rules versus negotiating. In addition to rules, I would say we have a politics of winners and losers, right? Some people get to win, some people get to lose, but nobody has to abide by the forms that go along with that. So I think, without taking us too far off track, I think the judicial supremacy is basically another form of technocracy. It is a flight from prudence. It is a flight from having to judge between complicated alternatives, and a desire for a sort of priesthood of judges to settle issues for us.
Yeah.
Not just alternatives, too. To win in the legislative arena is to bargain, is to compromise, to recognize that there are legitimate alternatives and there has to be some balancing between them. And to win in the judicial arena is, in many cases, to persuade a judge that your opponent is irrational and that there is actually only one way to resolve this question, or that there's a rule to be enforced. And that is to say that politics is the enforcement of rules, rather than that politics is a space for negotiating arrangements between legitimate but not equally wise alternatives. So it is to treat every question as an absolute question. And some questions are absolute questions, but some questions are not. And I think we've lost the knack for treating those seriously.
I think that's right.
So we have a few moments, so we're going to turn to the audience, to you all to ask questions. So please wait for a mic and identify yourself and then ask a real question. So right here.
Thank you all. My name is Kent Lassman. I'm at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. A very brief comment followed by a question. On the discussion about Plato and Aristotle and Thomas and all the ways you might understand Lincoln, I'd suggest an alternative, which is none of the above, but he's a student and practitioner of Euclid, which in his own writing he said, "This is what I studied." And in his speeches we see axioms and precepts over and over again. So it's just a different model for you to think through. The question is, to follow on Yuval's comment, we heard prudence described as a heroic virtue, as an intellectual virtue. My question for you is, do you understand it to be solely an individual virtue, or can it be a virtue of an institution, such as a journal, a newspaper, a think tank, a political party? How are we to understand prudence as a virtue, individual versus a more institutionalized?
It's a very good question. I just want to respond to the comment briefly first, which is Lincoln does speak of politics sometimes in Euclidean terms. To the extent that he does, I would side with Burke over his objections to mathematical and geometrical, arithmetic and geometrical approaches to to politics. I just think there are not as many straight lines and angles and so forth in politics as that approach would suggest. I'm very intrigued by the idea of prudence as a virtue of institutions or of a people, we might say, right? Not just of individuals. So that seems both tenable and important to me. I just haven't thought of it in those terms.
Well, go ahead.
I would just say to that question that I think prudence can be the product of a certain kind of institutional design, and that in some ways you can think of the U.S. Congress as designed to at least maximize the probability that prudential judgments will be made. There are different kinds of prudence, and there is, I think, such a thing as legislative prudence that is achieved by negotiation. There's also executive prudence, which is what we generally think of prudence as being, which I think is really a distinctly singular virtue. And we think now of the institutions of our constitutional system as divided, as defined by a divided use of power, or as advancing certain kinds of policy preferences. But it's important to think of them institutionally. They are distinct institutions. There is a legislative institution that is inherently plural, and there is an executive institution that is inherently singular. And I do think each of them has its own kind of prudence, and that the purpose of these kinds of prudence are different purposes. I think the framers are aware of this difference. I mean, there is such a thing as legislative action that is distinct from executive action, not only by being separated from it, but by having a different character than it.
Hamilton says that explicitly. He says that there's, when he refers to secrecy and dispatch, that's in the carrying out of decisions that have already been made in a deliberate way.
I just want to follow up very quickly on what you said about Euclid. I like your suggestion. My references to necessity and Lincoln's appeals to necessity were in a way trying to say that Lincoln goes about as far as you can in turning political decisions into physics, something like that.
I guess I have to be the only one that reminds everybody that he did read Shakespeare. So,
And the Bible, also. Yeah.
I just I've got to jump in on this issue of institutions having prudence. I mean, one of the things that we've lost is the political parties in the country were designed to provide a certain kind of political prudence. They're meant to temper, charismatic leaders, populism, and push things towards a principle. And one of the unique, you mentioned all those dates. I mean, one of the things about those dates is in the political science literature is those dates are meant to reflect critical elections where the parties themselves change to meet a crisis. So we've lost something in our political parties in the sense of both being able to moderate behavior in a sort of in a principled way, but also change to meet new circumstances that are required. So parties are in some ways designed for that. Another question, please.
My name is Cami Bhatt, and I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is about the basis of Declaration of Emancipation.
Sorry, about
the basis of Declaration of Emancipation. Some people say that Lincoln also thought about giving an option to African American to leave America and return where their origin is. Is that an ugly effort of diluting this man's greatness? I'm saying this because, in Muslim countries, people normally don't teach good thing about American heroes. But even in Pakistan, we learned a story when I was in 3rd or 4th grade that Abraham Lincoln was with some friends as a young man, and they saw a little animal who was trapped. And all friend of Abraham Lincoln left, they went to home, but he spent whole night trying to, free that little animal who has trapped himself among some stones. So I mean, these are the things that are taught about in even a crazy country, Muslim country like Pakistan. But some people who say that his decision to free black people was basically totally on calculation that South need a lot of labor because of agricultural things, and North didn't care much about. So he was just trying to score some point by freeing black people. So it's like, to me, it's like diluting this guy's natural greatness, that he had some divine qualities. Thank you very much.
Yes, Lincoln was an advocate of colonization earlier in his career, and even as president, encouraged colonization schemes. Once the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, he does not refer to colonization again. So for him, colonization was a possible strategy that could be combined with voluntary, gradual emancipation. It seems to me once the Emancipation Proclamation takes effect, immediate emancipation, his understanding is that the circumstances have now dramatically changed. You have 4 million freedmen, and his strategies to think about how to incorporate those new citizens into the polity change. And he begins moving in the direction of recommending at least a limited suffrage. So he puts forward the notion of the vote for African Americans. So I think this is not so much him actually changing in any deep way. I mean, I think his feelings from the beginning are anti-slavery and a true belief in the equality of all men. But he is thinking about how to deal with and handle white prejudice, which he's very aware of, in especially that decade before the Civil War. And colonization is part of a strategy to sort of deal with that white prejudice. He also thinks that there may be reasons why many freed slaves would want to leave the land of their oppressors. Remember, the model that would be available to Christians and readers of the Bible would be the Hebrews. When the Hebrews are freed, they don't consider remaining in the land of their oppressors. So I think he thought that this could be conceived in a way that might be better for both races. But once immediate emancipation happens, he realizes that colonization is off the table, and he begins thinking about other options.
Okay, one last question right here.
Hello, my name is Nicole Penn. I'm a program manager here at AEI. I was wondering if the panel could comment on Burke's case against Hastings, the impeachment, and that how that might reflect his prudential thinking.
I was afraid you were going to do that. Well, the case against Hastings is curious in a lot of ways. When he concludes I think it's the second day of speeches, he says he's impeaching Hastings in the name of natural law and in all these sort of abstractions that he otherwise repudiates as a basis of politics. And one could say, I think if one had a shallow conception of prudence, that pursuing this for 7 years or whatever it was, when it was sort of more or less doomed from the beginning, was imprudent. But I do think for Burke, it's important to remember that there are certain fixed abstract principles. The question is how they are reflected in politics, right? How they're refracted is what I meant to say into political life. But I find those speeches on Hastings to be some of the most challenging in all of Burke. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, I agree with that. I love the Hastings trial because there's so much text to work with, where otherwise Burke can be a little sparse. I think that he viewed that as an exception to his way of thinking about politics more generally, and he called on his party to take on that case because he thought that there was an exception necessary. The Whigs, by the end of the second year of the trial, thought this was the opposite of prudence. It was crazy. It was taking up a huge amount of time, and it took 7 years. And they knew they were going to lose the entire time. They did lose. But I think Burke saw it as as an opportunity to articulate something important about the way the Whigs thought about the politics of a kind of democratizing Britain, and the way they thought about the responsibility of the empire, though he doesn't call it the empire. And it was a place where he articulates principles and argues that politics sometimes has to answer to principles. And when those are violated, then action has to be taken. But he's almost explicit about the line that we've been laying out here, which is that there are times in politics when that's the case, but most of the time in politics, the question is not a question of legitimacy, but of the wisdom of different courses that are being considered. So that, generally speaking, politics is not about absolute principle, but is about more prudential judgments. And recognizing the exceptions to that is important, but it's also important to recognize those as exceptions and not to treat exceptions as a source of principles for life in general.
And I do think, if I could just add briefly to that he sees India fundamentally as an issue of national character.
Yeah.
Right? So he talks about these young men going away to India and making these obscene fortunes and coming back and transforming British society and so forth. So it does nicely bring us back to the issue of national character.
Well, first, I want to thank you all for coming out this evening and joining us for this panel and discussion. Second, go out and buy the book. Don't wait for the Netflix series.
I too.
Yeah, well, so give them to your brothers, sisters, relatives. And third, please join me in thanking the panel and Greg for a wonderful presentation. You survived. It was good.
I'm here. I was going to say I'm standing, but I'm sitting.